Greetings, friends and comrades. Thank you all so much for being with us today, this afternoon. Very excited to spotlight a new work, Psychoanalysis and Revolution, by David Pavón-Cuéllar and Ian Parker. Very happy to have this conversation. We have three very dynamic respondents. We're going to start off with an overview of the book, some of its aims, some of its goals, from Ian Parker and then from David. This is an open conversation. We hope to have questions at certain intervals. Please use the chat as much as you wish. Sharing of ideas, sharing of questions that emerge. This has been an exciting last few weeks to read this book. It written extremely lucidly, very coherently, which is sometimes rare in Lacanian theory. Also rare in Lacanian circles is to have sort of self-professed revolutionary commitments. So we're very excited and honored to spotlight Ian and David today for this event. Ian Parker is a practicing psychoanalyst of the Lacanian orientation. I just did a podcast with Ian on my podcast. If you get a chance, a very interesting conversation we had on Trotskyism today. I learned quite a lot in that conversation, and no doubt we will learn a lot today. If Alfie is here, I'm happy to introduce him, but if not, we will start off with Ian Parker at the moment. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. So the Psychoanalysis and Revolution Manifesto is an argument for the liberation movements that we're part of. It's not an easy argument, but a complex one that we travel through briefly and we hope accessibly. The key elements of the argument are to take psychoanalysis seriously as a radical resource, to beware of the way those ideas are psychologized and turned into ideological and practical instruments used against the exploited and oppressed, and to engage with the clinic, but on our own terms. So what are those terms? The clinical work we do is political. The clinic is political. But that's easy to say, and it's a statement that is dangerously multivalent, with consequences that take us in diverse contradictory directions, both clinically and politically. So the real question is, how is it so? How does politics enter into our clinical practice? And as the flip side of the question, how does clinical practice find its way into politics? Now, the difficulty we face in trying to answer that question is, among other things, because the conditions in which the clinical and the political are linked, the ways they intersect, are profoundly contextual and historical. There isn't one answer to the question, and the underlying nature of the political economic system that has given rise to the clinical as a distinctive phenomenon, a recent phenomenon, is characterized by unceasing mutability, by continual deep transformation of what is social and what subjectivity is. Marx captured the nature of this specific difficulty in this political economic system, capitalism, when he noted that the innovative spirit of capitalism is such that all existing social relations are dissolved, repeatedly dissolved. It is that, as Marx put it, everything that is solid melts into air. But just as certain configurations of social structure and interpersonal relationships seem to evaporate, so others form to take their place. They reform around and they support and they ideologically endorse the underlying material parameters of this society in which alienation is endemic. Capitalist society is the kind of society that calls upon clinical practice to heal the psychic wounds and to adapt people to unlivable circumstances. And the social relationships and structures that reform around relations of power, including heteropatriarchal relations that were critically challenged by socialist feminism, summed up their challenge in the slogan that the personal is political. So we have a task of mapping the coordinates of a complex changing society, a society that constitutes the clinical in a particular way. And we have a more difficult conceptual historical task of mapping the changes that make some kinds of political intervention at the level of subjectivity possible. That second, more difficult task includes mapping changes that make some kinds of political intervention at the level of subjectivity impossible, or at least that make that intervention susceptible to immediate recuperation, neutralization, absorption of our work back into the very thing we thought we were pitting ourselves against. So let's home in on a pair of conceptual cultural oppositional terms to make this clearer. One of the pairs is the opposition between private and public, an opposition that psychoanalysis has always treated in an appropriately dialectical manner. Psychoanalysis attends to distress that is intensely privatized, distress that is trapped in the body and mind of the analysand. And as a talking cure, the symptom is in some curious way always made public. It's put into language in the presence of at least one other, the analyst, or in an analytic group for some others. At the same time, back to the other side of the dialectic, the clinic is itself still a private enclosed space. And that's the condition for distress to be spoken about. The other opposition that we're more familiar with from feminist and to an extent Marxist discourse is between the personal and the political. For some activists turning to therapy, there's a conceptual and practical resource in psychoanalysis for connecting the two, treating the personal and political as two sides of the same coin. Now we know that the accusation leveled at those who are busy only shifting attention from the public sphere to the private sphere is, of course, that politics is thereby reduced to the personal. And there you start to see how the two oppositions between the private and public and between personal and political are often assumed to map onto each other. It's often assumed that the relationship between the private and public is somehow equivalent to the relationship between the personal and political, as if what is personal is private and as if what is public is political. Certain kinds of therapeutic interventions inside the clinic, such as dynamic administration of the clinical space, the direction of the treatment, mutative interpretation, and in the realm of social policy, including in advice columns and radio and television and other media platforms, are often predicated on this kind of mapping. Now, the difficulty, again, and to repeat the point I made earlier, is that these sets of relationships that govern how we think about what is interior to the clinic and what is exterior to it are not fixed and fast frozen, but are mutable, are continually being transformed. And these historical transformations are also geographical, with the history of colonialism and globalization marking what appears to be of the past, present, and future in these relations in different parts of the world in distinct ways. But is it not the case that there is now sometimes, not always, but sometimes, a completely different mapping of these conceptual cultural categories upon each other? On the one hand, what is personal is rendered almost equivalent to what is public. And on the other, what is private is treated as pretty well fused with what is conventionally represented as political. This is particularly the case on the terrain of globalized social media. On the one hand, our personal lives are monitored and tracked, and we willingly offer them up to public gaze, whether that is on Instagram, Snapchat, or reality TV. On the other hand, Political positions are often indexed to private life, evaluated according to moral examples advocated or followed, whether around ecological consciousness or sexual orientation. Some of us fervently resist this, but fail to avoid the pull of what we could refer to as these new structures of feeling in this kind of mapping. When we resist, we do so knowing that there are also reactionary attempts to guard the personal realm as intrinsically private, that rests on paranoid fantasies about the threat of social justice warrior woke politics in cancel culture that would make every aspect of our lives public and accountable, policed. To be clear as it is possible on this shifting terrain, I'm neither bemoaning this new state of affairs, as if it represents another perverse twist on a culture of narcissism once diagnosed by some conservative psychoanalytic cultural theorists. Nor am I hearkening back to a romanticized early capitalist age or pre-capitalist Eden, when we seemed to know what's what and who's who and what was rational and what was not. Nor, of course, am I pretending that we can cut through this with an objective analysis from a fantasy-free neutral position, standing outside all this. Each and every position in this matrix is suffused with desire and fantasy. Our claim in the manifesto, and I put it in necessarily condensed form here, is that it is psychoanalysis that attends to and treats contemporary forms of subjectivity in such a way as to resist the separation of normalized, globalized individual selves from each other. Subjectivity, psychoanalytically conceived, is the peculiar contradictory meshing together of the private and public, personal and political. We look to collective practices, and that is what we learn from the liberation movements, to treat the singularity of the subject as an opening to what is universal about our suffering, to solidarity. That is why we're critical of globalization while being internationalists, and that is what we mean by the clinic as politics. Now, it's understandable that one reaction to this situation is to appeal to what is really there under the surface, to what has been disclosed by scientific reason, as if the rot set in with postmodernism and relativist cultural discourse, rather than being, as it is, a condition of life under capitalism. In that reaction, in our clinical training and practice, lies the lure of morally coercive approaches, such as neuroscience, and to put it simply, a return to psychiatric versions of psychoanalysis. It is equally understandable that another reaction to this situation is to appeal to deep connection between people, an intuitive relationship in which there's some kind of quasi-telepathic access of unconscious meaning via what some psychoanalysts conceive of as counter-transference, or even to a reciprocal disclosure of experience in order to create deeper social bonds, relational psychoanalysis being an example. In that reaction, in our clinical training and practice, lies the lure of commonsensical humanism, and, to put it simply, an embrace of psychotherapeutic versions of psychoanalysis. We learn from historical analyses of surveillance and confession that operate in such a way as to provide the cultural apparatus of a globalized capitalist economy, that these two reactions, psychiatric and psychotherapeutic, are not in simple immediate competition with each other, but are twins. Surveillance and confession together lock us into social relationships that at the one moment define how patients are expected to think and feel, psychiatric, and at the next moment require clients to configure their experience according to dominant structures of feeling, psychotherapeutic. The danger is that psychiatric and therapeutic versions of psychoanalysis very easily channel their own clinical discourse into paths that intensify the public evaluation of personal life, as well as the political moral regulation of the private sphere. Rather than simply provide gentle reminders that it's good to talk and to share feelings, some versions of psychoanalysis are thereby drawn into an incitement to speak in a certain kind of way and to reinforce models of subjectivity that pretend to define what is normal and what is abnormal. We take a different path in the manifesto, differentiating what we describe in the radical history and clinical practice of psychoanalysis from psychiatry, psychotherapy, and psychology, from the psi professions. Psychoanalysis is a form of critical psychology, but effectively an anti-psychology, reclaiming a theory and practice about who we are and what we could be in the liberation movements. Psychoanalysis that respects the singularity of the human subject also necessarily stands against the globalization of its discourse, as if that were a universal grid, as if it were a worldview, and against the reduction of analysans to particular constellations of predefined characteristics. We shift our focus from the fantasy of an immutable, biologically given bedrock of development and disorder to the relation between the subject and language. We treat the elements of the mind we refer to in our work not as having been discovered by Freud and his colleagues, but as being invented for us to make use of in our clinical work. And we refuse to use our own understanding of these processes as a tool of suggestion, either inside the clinic or outside of it. So to conclude, the force is pitted against psychoanalysis by shifting configurations of common sense, by the ideological infrastructure of capitalist and late capitalist society are immense. That's why we need political analysis of the place and role of the clinic, to treat the clinic as a form of politics, as a problem, as well as an arena of struggle, where we struggle against the very form that enables our work to take place. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ian. We're going to hear now from David Pavón-Cuellár, the co-author of the manifesto. David, thank you for being with us. How are you? Welcome.
Hi, Daniel. Thanks to you for the invitation.
Good to see you. Good to see you again. Congratulations on the book. So David will give you 15 minutes. David has written widely in Marxist theory and Lacanian psychoanalysis. He's a professor in Mexico, and we had him on a few months ago to talk about Gabriel Tupinamba's book. And he sort of, I don't know, started a brush fire in a very good way, or maybe a lightning bolt. I don't know what metaphor to use, but nonetheless, very happy to have you. And we have 15 minutes. Please go.
Our manifesto arises from a kind of commission. In the spring of 2019, a Marxist publisher told me that he had met activists who perceived the political importance of the subjective factor and wanted to know more about psychoanalysis to address emotional problems in their organizations. These people were interested in the thoughts of Zizek and others, but they did not understand them very well. So there was a need for a book on psychoanalysis that would be easy, understandable for non-specialists, and useful for militants of radical left social movements. The publisher asked me if I could write this book or translate something that already existed in another language, or if I knew someone who could write the book. I naturally thought of Ian Parker, whom I asked for advice in Havana a few months later in the summer of 2019. I made two proposals to Ian. Either he would write the book and I would translate it to Spanish, or we would write it together. He chose the second proposal. The original idea was expanded and radicalized under Ian's influence. The book would no longer be only in Spanish, and it should also be freely disseminated. He later made the publisher who had commissioned the book lose interest in the project, but he understood us and we understood him too. We went ahead and wrote a text that is truly ours, with a paragraph from me and another from Ian, a word from Ian and another from me, but always with the agreement of both. I think that this way of proceeding was already revolutionary, trans-individual, radically collective. What is certain is that we adopted a position that was neither mine nor Ian's, but ours, corresponding to everything that unites us: communism, anti-capitalism, Marxism, Lacanian psychoanalysis, critical psychology, and so on. The difficult thing was not to agree, but to carry out the purpose of writing an easy text, accessible to all and not only to those already familiar with Lacanian psychoanalysis. We may not have fully served this purpose. It's something I think about after Ian told me last week that our manifesto was still too difficult. Making an easy-to-read book was very important to us. Our idea was to fulfill the original commission and get out of the usual self-referential confinement of the academic and intellectual sphere. This closure is quite accentuated among those who are inspired by Jacques Lacan in political thought, perhaps because they have inherited some of the complexity intrinsic to Lacan's ideas. It is true that there are Lacanian authors such as Zizek in Europe, Alemán in Argentina, or Safatli and Dunker in Brazil, who maintain influential political discourses related to the left, but the influence has cultural and social limits, being generally confined to educated urban sectors that occupy middle or high social strata and live in certain cities, in Buenos Aires, Sao Paulo, Paris, or New York, but not so much in La Paz, Kinshasa, Warsaw, or Delhi. Those who were called the masses tend to distrust Lacanian political complications. We find the same mistrust in the organizations and movement of the radical left. This distrust is justified. Intellectuals who can only communicate among themselves, among intellectuals, cannot be true organic intellectuals in the Gramscian sense of the word. They cannot organically unite with the people by making common cause with them. At best, they will constitute a vanguard that will only transmit its thought to the masses in a simplified and necessarily deceptive form. This deception reinforces the isolation of intellectuals from ordinary people. It seems that the isolation of the intellectuals who only speak among themselves is a price to pay for the difficulty in thinking. Ian and I had to overcome this difficulty to get out of our intellectual academic seclusion and reach the activists and others for whom we had written the manifesto. We had to write an easy-to-read book. The problem is that what is easily understandable, as Lacan has pointed out, usually corresponds to what we have already understood, to the prejudices of common sense, to the false evidences of what we must believe. What we can easily understand is the koiné that was so justly repudiated by Lacan as well. It is the set of ruling ideas, of the ideas of the ruling class, as we know from Marx and Engels. Giving in to power is the easiest. Ease is a kind of submission, of surrender, in which we let ourselves be carried away by the current of power and its dominant ideology. Swimming against the current, rebelling, or at least resisting, implies a certain difficulty. This meant for Ian and me that our manifesto had to be difficult, at least to some degree, to have a subversive and revolutionary potential, however minimal. But the difficulty of the manifesto threatened to keep it locked up in intellectual circles, preventing it from reaching activists and condemning it thus perhaps to a certain political ineffectiveness. Our choice would then be between a subversive but ineffective difficulty and an effective but not truly subversive facility. In other words, Ian and I should choose between, on the one hand, an easy manifesto that reaches grassroots activists but remains common sense and does not provoke any real subversion, and on the other hand, a truly subversive book that would break with common sense but would be therefore so difficult that it would have no effect, as it would be read only by a few scholars. The dilemma seemed to be between ease and difficulty, between activists and intellectuals, between giving in and not giving in to the dominant ideology, and so on. In reality, this dilemma does not stand up to the slightest analysis. Rather, it is a false dilemma that is due to two old prejudices widely spread in the progressive intelligentsia. One of the prejudices of left-wing intellectuals is that they are the only ones capable of escaping the dominant ideology. This would paradoxically mean, as the young Stalin said in 1905, that the working masses are lost in the darkness of bourgeois ideology, and that for this reason they need the educated representatives of the possessing classes, bourgeois intellectuals like Marx and Engels, who are the only ones capable of freeing themselves from the dominant ideology, end quote. The truth is that the ideologization of the bourgeoisie, even of the bourgeois intellectuals, does not seem to be less than that of the workers. But the exteriority, the inadequacy, and the suffering of the workers with respect to this ideology made them a promise for Marx and Engels. Another prejudice of progressive intellectuals is that their thinking is more difficult than that of ordinary people. The truth is that the concretion of common ideas, as Marx well pointed out, is an inextricable condensation that contains much more complexity than the abstract concepts of science and philosophy. A psychoanalytic concept, even a Lacanian one, is much simpler than any of the unfathomable evidences of common sense. Lacan knew this very well. He also knew, in the same sense, that the apparently simple ideas of children are more complex than the most elaborate scholastic. And he was not unaware that Lévi-Strauss had found more complexity in wide thinking than in civilized science. The difficulty is not where we think it is. It is not in the academic centers of concentration and accumulation of epistemologically legitimized and purified knowledge, but in indigenous communities and popular neighborhoods where knowledge has not detached itself from the body or life and is deployed in each gesture and in each word. The complexity is in the children's enigmatic games rather than the work routines of their methodically stupid parents. The complexity is in the streets and in social movements more than in those universities where everything tends to be simplified. The master's university knowledge results not only from the plundering of the slaves' know-how that was denounced successively by Marx and Lacan, but also from a degradation, fragmentation, and trivialization of everything that is so complex that it can only be known collectively through communities or social movements. This was understood very well by Rosa Luxemburg and Georgi Lukács when they situated true materialism in the complexity inherent in that social trans-individual thought, which cannot be thought by individuals, not even by those individuals who claim to know more than the masses and who were mockingly called school teachers, first by Marx and then by Luxemburg. When intellectuals abandon the materialism of collective thought, they tend spontaneously to idealism. They thus tend, in other words, to the simplification of the material complexity of each thing, that complexity that Freud discovered in the internal world of dreams and that Karel Teige and Louis Althusser later rediscovered in the external world of economics, ideology, and culture. As we know, Althusser described this complexity with the Freudian concepts of condensation and overdetermination, both summarized in a structural causality immanent like that of Spinoza, where the whole structure overdetermines each thing and is condensed in it. Recognizing this unthinkable circumstance, which cannot be reduced to any idea, is what we do unconsciously at every moment, thus proceeding in a materialistic way. Materialism requires academics and intellectuals to accept the particular insertion of each one in the collectivity, or better said, in the transindividuality, in the transindividual exteriority of the unconscious, in that single language without meta-language that unfolds in an absolutely different way to each one of us. Nothing more complex than this language. To proceed as good materialists and appreciate something as of its material complexity, it is enough to listen carefully, putting into practice the listening that we learn from Freud, listening without understanding, without having clear ideas about what is heard, without trying to encompass what is heard in an idea, as those the idealists. Freud's materialist listening has a long history outside of psychoanalysis. Marx and Engels knew how to listen to the labor movement in this way. This listening cost Rosa Luxemburg her life for putting what she heard before what she thought. Then Mao Zedong put this listening at the foundation of his mass line. I dare say that materialist listening is a method by which Ian and I have written our manifesto. It is a method that I learned several years ago from Ian, from his discourse analysis proposal, a realistic proposal, not falsely objective, but committed and immersed in the world. Ian and I have put this listening into practice not only by writing the manifesto together, but listening to each other in each line, in each word, but also by listening to that collective that spoke to us through the other and about which we have no clear idea. This is the same thing that we try to listen in the buzz of the world around us, in the news and in the other discourses of the events of our time. What we listen resonates in our manifesto. It is not something simple, but its complexity is that of the world as it can be perceived both outside and inside of us through Marxism and psychoanalysis. So we hope that what we write makes sense for any reader, for any of us, for activists, and not just for intellectuals or academics. The difficulty with our manifesto is not that which we find in the sophisticated conceptions and conceptualization of science and philosophy. We have looked for a way to reduce each idea to its simplest expression, and we have tried to use as few psychoanalytic concepts as possible. Even so, as Ian told me a few days ago, our manifesto is difficult. Yes, this book is difficult. It is difficult as life is difficult. My conviction, perhaps too optimistic, is that the difficulty of our manifesto is precisely that of life, which is often avoided in intellectual and academic simplifications, and that was vindicated in the wonderful praise to difficulty by the Colombian Marxist Stanislao Zuleta. The difficulty of our manifesto is also the difficulty to conceive and conceptualize what is materially displayed through our ideas, actions, and relationships. It is a difficulty that is present in everything that we are and do, and that is therefore difficult to represent. How to represent the lack of distance and difference between the inner and the outer world, or between the individual and society? How to think of the individual as an individuation of the social or the cultural? How to understand that a true liberation requires liberation not only of oneself, but from oneself? All this is difficult to think about because of the ideology that prevents us from thinking about it easily. Ideology imposes the difficulty to think about what we are and what ideology does with us, how it digs an interior inside each one and encloses ourselves in it, thus imprisoning our body in the soul of each one, detaching ourselves from others and from the rest. It is difficult to think about all this because it is forbidden to think about it. And it is forbidden because it is dangerous to think about it, because not thinking about it is a condition for the proper functioning of a system like the economic, political one of capitalism. Our exploitation in the unconscious subsumed in capital, demands our unconsciousness. Class consciousness cannot free us from the unconscious, but perhaps it can help free us from the lucrative and destructive subsumption of the unconscious in capitalism. It was against this resistance of capital that we wrote our manifesto. To be anti-capitalist, our manifesto had to be difficult like life, like the life drive with its detours, deviations, diversions, and distractions. The complicated entanglement of life is irremediably opposed to the simplicity of capital with its death drive, with its drive satisfaction in a short circuit, in a straight line on the shortest path to death. This is the path of capital producing death in the faster, shorter, and cheaper way by transforming everything living into something better, into more and more accountable money. Nothing simpler than deadly capital accounting. Nothing easier than dying, than surrendering to death, as we are doing right now by surrendering ourselves to annihilation, to the destruction of the world by capitalism. Thank you.
Bravo, comrade. Thank you so much, David. Thank you so much. Briefly, before we turn to our panel, we want to invite Alfie Baun, who is professor of media and culture and a Lacanian author of video game theory, based in London, and who has just launched 1968 Press. So Alfie, tell us about 1968 Press and welcome to this event.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, I'll just be very, very brief. It's an absolute pleasure to see everyone here, and thanks so much to Ian and David, and also to everyone. I just here really to sort of mention that this book has come out with our new a new publishing venture that we've started here in the UK, mostly in London. And you know, it's a perfect first book for us because we're precisely interested in producing things which are for everyone, as David was just saying, but which do not sort of popularize or simplify complicated and important questions. So it's a publishing house that is going to try to combine politics with critical theory, but publish books which speak in a way that can activate everyone in an activist way. You know, we've started with this perfect book, which is an absolute pleasure to be part of. So we're very proud to be doing that. And we've got some really exciting books coming. I can just mention one. We've some coming from the Lacanian School, which is my kind of, those that know me will know that's my main kind of interest. But the very next should, I think, be a book by Alice Beckerhoe, unfortunately mainly known for being Guy Debord's wife, but in fact an incredible author, activist, and philosopher in her own right. And this will be her first kind of book published in English language. She's now 81, and it's a recent book that she's written. It's phenomenal and speaks to a lot of the things that Ian and David's book does too, although in a different way. And then, and following that, we'll have some, I think, from the Lacanian School. So we hope to really sort of carve out our kind of niche in this kind of popular facing, but theoretically rigorous publishing. And that's it really. You guys can find us at various places, our website 1968press.co.uk, and we have a Patreon which you can do for as little as £2. Hopefully everyone who's here received the free copy I sent to everyone, or Daniel did on our behalf. But I will put our links in the chat, you know, just our Twitter and our Patreon and our website. But we really appreciate everyone's support, and please do just check us out and look out for the next things that are coming. And yeah, thanks for having me to sort of join in for a few minutes. I've really enjoyed the talks, and I'll be listening to the rest of it as well. Just an absolute pleasure to publish Ian and David's absolutely brilliant first book for our press, which really, I hope, sets the tone for what we're going to do. So thank you, Daniel, and thanks everyone.
Thank you so much, Alfie. Truly an international meeting. Be thinking of questions. We're about to jump into our respondent panel. We're going to first hear from Nadia Ali, who is a Lacanian theorist and assistant professor at the Civilization Studies program at the American University of Beirut. Nadia is also the author of the recent book, which is entitled Psychoanalysis and a Love of Arabic. Nadia, thanks for being with us. Very happy to give you the floor for about 20 minutes or so, as you wish.
Okay, thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, welcome.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with everyone in this conversation. Thanks for inviting me to kind of respond to the manifesto. If I take too long, please stop me. I'm not sure about how long what I have. I mean, there's a lot of ideas, so maybe what I have might be slightly over time, but just tell me to stop and I'll stop. I really like the way the manifesto is written. I think it's very generous, somewhat hospitable to the current political and theoretical horizon. And I think this generosity is necessary from the side of psychoanalysis, which, as we all know, is a very sectarian, combative field from the very beginning. The manifesto made me imagine that the first thing people on the left have to do, and I'm not quite sure if it's before or after the revolution, is to go into analysis in order to get rid of both psychoanalysis and the pathologies of group formations. A bit like Lenin's escape to Siberia after the revolution, an escape into psychoanalysis, but only with the hope of bringing an end to analysis. And then liberation really begins. So in a sense, the first role of the party would be to dissolve the party, work through its collective pathologies without reaffirming a liberal individual ego. But how and when does analysis end anyway? Does transference ever really get dissolved? Can we wait for analysis to end for revolution to begin, or has the revolution already begun in modernity and psychoanalysis is already a reaction to that? These are hard questions, and hence the form of the manifesto that the authors choose, promoting an idea that would hopefully haunt us, analysts and analysans, revolutionaries and not, in the present. Like the one Freud himself was haunted by, psychoanalysis as the very symptom of the malaise in civilization, and somehow its only hope. So in a sense, I read the manifesto as being, a great addition to the business of defending a lot of impossible and lost causes. The four notions that the authors wish to rescue from capitalist ideological cooptation, and these are the points that structure the different chapters of the book, are one, the reification of the unconscious into a private individual thing versus its actuality as a collective phenomenon. Two, the reduction of repetition to neurotic compulsion, the compulsion to labor and to enjoy, rather than allowing for the possibility of a repetition with difference. Three, the automation of the drive, as the authors call it, that empties it out from its creative capacity for the sake of its destructive actuality. Four, the transformation of transference into a clinical phenomena that increases a dependence on an other rather than allows for a transformative act of freedom based on coming to terms with the role of ideological love in instilling models of authority in society. So the general Marxian question, I guess, that they address through these 4 points is, how can psychoanalysis be transformed from just another tool in the social reproduction of capital, of structures like family, coloniality, patriarchy, etc., to become a means for liberation? So I have a number of remarks that revolve around three main points. One, the relationship between history and structure from a psychoanalytic view, and the problem of periodization as it's tackled in the book. I'm sorry if I'm making things more difficult than easier. And perhaps, but these are the points that come to mind when I read the manifesto. So one, this relationship between history and structure, the question of periodization, can we periodize the unconscious or not? Which may be a misreading on my part, but perhaps somewhat this could be clarified. Two, the account of the drive and repetition that the authors provide, or the question of how do we have a good repetition without the bad one. Three, the importance of articulating the relationship between psychoanalysis and science as being different from that between science and capitalism. And I think this point, it's a very complicated point. There's no time for this, but for me, this point resonates or has to do with the question of transference, the dissolution of transference, and ultimately, effectively, with the question of the transmission of psychoanalysis. So the aim of the manifesto, again, to go back, is to counter what the authors call an adaptive psychoanalysis with a revolutionary practice of psychoanalysis that is at once necessary but somewhat impossible. And the broad aim is to argue for the move from the necessity of psychoanalysis and its simultaneous impossibility in capitalism to the possibility of psychoanalysis without its necessity in post-liberation societies. So in order, or in kind of liberated societies, and in order to make this move from impossibility to necessity, I guess we have to focus on the subject of psychoanalysis, which the authors do, the speaking being that emerges from the practice of analysis, the one that begins as a singularity, develops into an absolute, from contingency to necessity, retroactively working through all the illusions and myths of the ego that the subject encounters in analysis. But again, the question that's pressing for me still is, how do we move from the psychoanalytic theory of the subject to liberationist politics? And I'm reminded here of Jean-Claude Milner's statement in Louvre Clair that Lacan somehow realized that politics is destined to always be out of sync with the modern universe, in which the unconscious has already been discovered. The modern universe, in which signifiers, science, have real material effects, is the one, after all, within which the subject of the unconscious is located. In it, on the one hand, politics always falls short of the revolutions in thought that characterize modernity. Politics is plagued by repetition compulsions, the return of the repressed, the ego as an avatar of all that has passed and haunts our modern condition. And it is also in modernity that the field of psychoanalysis forms, which since Freud is very much characterized by stated indifference to politics, which I can see that the authors, as well as I think many of us here, share a kind of a disgruntlement with. Right? So this field of psychoanalysis that forms, and since Freud is characterized by this stated indifference to politics, yet is somewhat completely steeped in political questions from the start, from questions about identity and identification, sex and sexuation, sexuality, group formations, etc. So this stated indifference that motivates the author's manifesto, how to provoke the psychoanalytic indifference to politics, from what I understand. And here, I think that what they refer to as the clinical practice. How to turn analysts into Marxists or Marxists into analysts. And if we do that, again, a question, does that really guarantee an exit from capitalist domination? However, and here's where I have some critical remarks, I suppose. The way I read it, the manifesto, and perhaps unwittingly, tends to historicize psychoanalysis in the claim that there would be a necessary psychoanalysis in capitalism and a possible one without it. That there would be a break between a discourse of capitalism, and I ask, is there such a discourse of capitalism, and that of revolution? Again, is there a discourse for revolution besides that of the hysteric? Is the discourse of the analyst the discourse of revolution? I don't know. So here I have a question about periodization and its relationship to the unconscious. Can we periodize the unconscious? Does it submit to the logic of history? An unconscious that is historically specific to capitalism and one that isn't. And if it doesn't, do we risk transcendentalizing the unconscious, making it ahistorical? A move that neither Freud nor Lacan would have desired, and I think neither would we. Perhaps the answer would be no to both questions. The unconscious isn't outside of history, nor is it historically specific. Rather, it is an extimate structure that has a logic and a temporality that is not punctuated by the linear historical time or the illusion of that in Capital. So what is at stake here, again, is what comes back is the question of the subject that is not reducible to the ego, and which I think the book really makes a very strong point in arguing against or for this point, the ego as being the site of resistances to all the revolutionary forces of symptoms or liberationist potentials of symptoms, a point that is really well noted in this book. So the author's answer to this problem of the relation between structure and history, or the logic of structure and history, is that with the liberation from capitalism, the hope is that there would be a liberation from a bad repetition, the bad side of the drive, and a focus on a good repetition, on the drive as a creative actuality versus its destructive acephalic function. So there are moments in the text or in the manifesto where this formulation leaves me slightly perplexed. In a sense, it's a bit of a question of, can we have our cake and eat it? Can we have a drive that is good without a bad drive? And this may perhaps be due to a misreading on my part, but sometimes the authors seem to suggest that we could have some enjoyment or jouissance without so much suffering. And as they put it, I think, and perhaps close words or just a paraphrasing of the words, could we make our own, could we make our own history without simply suffering it? I think this is the way they state it. So ultimately here, it appears to be that sublimation, in a certain sense, is what is at stake. How to enjoy and sublimate surplus enjoyment at the same time. Another question that is, not simple to answer, but that the manifesto leaves one with. The way I understand repetition is that it is always about the repetition of a loss, of trying to find something that was not there to begin with, a repetition of an original failure to properly repeat something. So compulsions are in this sense utilitarian without real utility. They make use of something in the place of a useless thing, of a missing thing. Now here the authors argue that there is nothing biological or instinctual in repetition compulsions. And I quote them, "Failure is not hardwired in us biologically, but is a result of the history of domination," end of quote. So they give examples here of workers who unconsciously adopt the ideas of the ruling class, trade unions, replicating paternal authority, the mimesis implicit in the colonial relations, all forms of identification that ensnare the subject in fantasies of capital. However, here we have to insist on a point that the unconscious does not think, but it works, it labors. And as we know, ideal labor in capitalism is one that is without qualities, reduced of all quality. So I find the lack of the discussion of unconscious labor, or the labor of the unconscious, in relationship to domination in the book slightly confusing, perhaps would be something to be addressed. So whether hardwired biologically or not, domination from a psychoanalytic account is surely not just a historical phenomenon, but is linked to the fundamental aggressivity of the subject in relationship to an object, in the dialectic of identification. That is always kind of somewhat encapsulated in the question of how to be and have what I love. And here it's important to point out that nature or biology are not bereft of domination, and radical progressives, in a certain sense, must tread this path very carefully. Not all progress is domination, even if capitalism is a version of bourgeois progressivism. Surely capitalism and the capitalist drive invest in unconscious labor, but we can't just revert to some notion of the body or biology to escape domination. So, I think the authors are both aware of this, and they're clearly in what they've said that this is a point that they're aware of. But I think the stakes here are very serious, and for anyone engaged in psychoanalysis, the stakes are very high. And perhaps, I think the question is, in a certain sense, do we go with Lacan or Marcuse on this point? There's differences. There's different paths in this regard. How to think of constitutive alienation of the very relation we have to our bodies in the Lacanian understanding that is based on being captivated by a deformed image of the body from the very start, or the body as deformed image tout court from the beginning. And what's the difference between surplus enjoyment and Marcuse's account here of surplus repression. Big jump from first question to the second, but I think there's something that the manifesto kind of wakes up, and particularly someone reading from a Lacanian perspective, that this encounter between Freudo-Marxism, Marcuse and Lacan is somewhat in the background that somehow needs to be fully rehearsed in its dimensions. And I think the manifesto raises these issues, even if it's unwittingly, or even if it's, I mean, in a sense, this is just kind of what it kind of made me consider. So here, if we take, and if I take Lacan's side here, because of course, as psychoanalysis is sectarian in its constitution. If we take seriously Lacan's claim that all of history is fallacious, we can only uphold the historicity of one dimension, and the authors agree on that in the manifesto, the ego. The ego is in a sense finite and historical, constituted by imaginary functions, while the unconscious isn't. Rather, it is the infinite that disturbs the whole, or the not all that haunts the specular image of the all. Of course, the unconscious isn't only specific to capitalist society, however, it emerges within the purview of the modern scientific episteme, which in turn is coincidental to the rise of modern capitalism. However, there is no necessary link between the discourse of science and that of capital. The latter is headless, irrational, while science in its particular strain, let's say for Lacanians at least, of mathematical formalization in the form of the matheme and in topology, is what Lacan promised to be the only line of transmission of psychoanalysis. So there's a big stake here in the sense of what perception of science are we talking about, what account of science, and what relationship between psychoanalysis and which science are we talking about. So in a certain sense, at the risk of sounding a bit fanatic here, the unconscious has implications for how we consider the universe entirely. And this is something to consider here. And here, of course, Lacan's point, right? God is unconscious. Modern science precisely attacks this God and the world of antiquity, right? While psychoanalysis attacks the ego, whose avatars we see parading in a society organized around commodity production. I mean, there's a lot at stake in this point here. And coming to my last point, which I guess is perhaps between point 2 and point 3, the points are not very organized, but continuing with this issue of science, Freud and Lacan in different ways negotiate a place for psychoanalysis in relationship to science in somewhat opposing ways. Freud claims it as an ideal science. Lacan relativizes and nominalizes it as a theory of discourse or social bond, at least starting in the late 60s. And discourses for Lacan aren't punctuated by historical shifts or breaks. So I'm kind of coming back to my very first point, right? They're not. The movement of discourses or the transformations of discourses into other discourses is not characterized by discontinuity and rupture and break, a la Foucault or a la Althusser perhaps, or so on, but by what I think that this is kind of Milner's term here, the doctrine of the plurality of terms. In a discourse, every element can be heterogeneous and different. The hysterics discourse is a permutation of the masters, the university of the hysterics, and the master, etc. So in a sense, discourses slide into each other or transform into one another. And in this book, the authors situate psychoanalysis in relationship to 3 coincidental fields. And I'm thinking how to map out these fields on the discourses, right? 2 that lay claim to science, psychology and psychiatry, to the university discourse. 1 to a master's discourse, perhaps, to ideology, well-being, and therapy. The first 2 correspond to the university discourse. The last one, therapeutics, to the master's discourse. Well-being and therapy, self-care, effectively are somewhat close to that of the discourse of the master. They claim that the ego can be a master in its own house, adapted, enjoying without any surplus, and so on. So it would be interesting here to consider whether we can, the question of periodization, or how can, what leaves one a bit slightly perplexed, how to have psychoanalysis before and after liberation, how to think of that structurally and historically. Perhaps there's a way to consider that in relationship to the theory of discourse. And I think in conclusion here, we all know that Freud had claimed psychoanalysis as an impossible profession, like parenting and teaching, the 3 impossible vocations, impossible forms of mastery. And to be more accurate, if we add Lacan to Freud, they're impossible because they are conditioned by an impossibility. So this impossibility for psychoanalysis is the real, which disturbs the functions of the imaginary and the symbolic. And in both Lacan and Freud, there's an insistence on situating psychoanalysis in relationship to the discourse of science, precisely because for both of them, the two discourses deal with a common object. And Lacan adds to Freud's claim that the impossibility of psychoanalysis pertains to the role it plays in relationship to orders of signification, to language, which the book forefronts in a very enlightening way and in a very clear way. The impossible in psychoanalysis, after Lacan, is the real, while psychoanalysis itself functions in the register of the symbolic, in the register of language, of speech, in the ways through which the speaking being seeks to grasp the disappearing object of desire. So the impossibility that happens in psychoanalysis is not simply the transformation of the unconscious into consciousness, but its passage into speech. Now, a second layer of complication is added to the act of speaking, what always remains unsaid. The words that are relayed are addressed to others who are always missing from the intersubjective interaction, particularly in the clinic. Analysants speak to the dead more than to the living, to images of the ego that are mute and dumb, just like the analyst, at least most of the time, until the ego is exhausted of its resistances, deploys all the garrisons to counter the full speech that slowly unfolds in analysis. So psychoanalysis is, in a sense, a witness to the impossibility, this impossibility that happens, the material effects of impossibility on the subject foremostly. And here, what is important is that the insistence that the authors have on considering this speaking being's problem, the way that psychoanalysis addresses particularly this, is that they recognize the collective nature of the unconscious. However, I mean, at the risk of, as I say, making things slightly more difficult, the promises in a certain sense for extrapolating from this transformation of the subject from the singular to the absolute, from the contingent to the necessary, to a general psychoanalysis for liberation, still feels like it requires, some more steps, perhaps some more points to be covered. And it just kind of somewhat, the manifesto leaves me thinking with a question of, will there ever be a time when psychoanalysis will no longer be necessary for the speaking being? I mean, it should almost can we ask the question, how can we get rid of psychoanalysis? Perhaps, I mean, it may be easier to get rid of capitalism in a certain sense than to get rid of psychoanalysis. And I think I'll just stop here. This is kind of a set of remarks I had in relationship to the book. Yeah, sorry if I went over time.
No, brilliant. Thank you so much, Nadia. And Ian and David, I'm sure you have many things to say. Please make a note of your comments, and we will turn immediately to you at the conclusion. I'm now very pleased to introduce our next speaker, Isabel Millar, who is a wonderful Lacanian theorist and the author of a great new book called The Psychoanalysis of Artificial Intelligence with the Palgrave Lacan series. Isabel, welcome. Thank you for being here, and the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Daniel. Let me just get myself together. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really nice to be with you all. And well, first of all, just to congratulate Ian and David on their fantastic book, which I really enjoyed reading, and which I think has really managed to strike a balance between addressing the complex problems of psychoanalysis as a political tool and making the ideas accessible to a non-specialist audience, which I think is fundamental here. I think it's a great summary of Lacan's 4 fundamental psychoanalytic concepts and has a genuine potential to give its readers the courage and confidence in their convictions that they're not suffering alone and that something can be done. And, reading the book, you're really struck by the sort of bold manifesto style. And in a sense, it's sort of actually more like a spoken text than a written one. And this sort of parrhesiastic engagement with the immediacy of language has as its aim to mobilize, motivate, and provoke the reader into action, as opposed to mere chin stroking. And perhaps for some clinical Lacanian or academic Marxist readers, this kind of rhetorical prose might seem problematic in that it can appear to bend difficult theoretical ideas to the will of a transitory political effect or affect even. Something which on the one hand, many Lacanianists are not fond of, and on the other is often Zizek's complaint about some left-wing activists acting urgently before they think, when the task is to urgently think and take no action. But as the authors point out, it's not their interest in the book to advocate for the dissemination of psychoanalytic theory, nor even clinical practice, but rather to mobilize the revolutionary potential of some of the fundamental ideas of psychoanalysis that are often untapped by staying within the confines of rarefied academic debate, or for the privileged minority able to go into analysis. I mean, indeed, there are many books on political and clinical psychoanalysis which demand the sort of slow theoretical attention and invite endless academic infighting between various factions of the psychoanalytic and political left on exactly the correct interpretation of this or that concept or text. And this, of course, being the perennial problem with Lacano-Marxist scholarship, and indeed the crux of the debate between communism and anarchism. At what point does praxis take precedence over theory? However, this book has a very particular aim in mind, and also quite a different audience it seeks to address than perhaps comparable previous volumes on the question of revolution and psychoanalysis might have done. In this sense, I think it's truly egalitarian. And it's deliberately conversational, and as the authors admit, conspicuously, deliberately unscholarly approach. The book does away with much of the type of academic name-checking that can often hamper political works. And as such, I can see this being genuinely read from people from all walks of life, not just those inside the academic or activist world, places which are still replete with class and educational privilege. For this reason, I think it's really powerful. And I think we could, call it a sort of gateway drug to politicizing the most marginalized in society, and also something that I could see young teenagers being able to engage with at a time when they most need to be politically active, but are often unable to. So 3 questions that arise from the positing of a manifesto: what, who, and how. That's to say, what's the problem being identified, who is it addressing, and how are they to proceed? The simple answers to these questions that the book posits are: the problem is our suffering under capitalism, patriarchy, colonialism, and racism, but we're all victims of it regardless of race, gender, or class, and the only way to proceed is to unilaterally recognize our shared predicament. So with a task so vast and universalized, it might seem impossible to know where to begin or how this can really apply to all of us despite our enormous differences. And this is precisely where the question of psychoanalysis enters the picture. For psychoanalysis in practice, the only material there is to work with is the singular, unique, and potentially incalcitrant symptom of the subject or analysant, a form of enjoyment in one's suffering that we all live with by virtue of being speaking sexed subjects. Notwithstanding some misconceptions about the psychoanalytic establishment, for psychoanalysis, clinically speaking, there is no such thing as a normal, sane, or even healthy person, just different ways of getting along with one's jouissance. The only real aim of analysis, which as the authors point out may have ancillary therapeutic effects, is to enable oneself to love, work, and desire. But there are no prescribed ways of doing this, and each subject must discern for themselves the most livable way of dealing with their own jouissance. So how does this become political? Again, a perennial question within Lacanian circles. As is the credo of the Lacanian clinic, each subject is dealt with on a one-by-one basis. Every form of suffering is unique, and there are no norms to apply, only subjective structures which orient the direction of the treatment, which is potentially interminable. However, as this book outlines effectively, psychoanalysis is political because the unconscious is politics. The unconscious is the discourse of the other, and the unconscious is structured like a language. Politics, in its basic meaning, is the expression of the conflict that arises from alienated beings trying to live as a collective force, a seemingly impossible task, but one which we must never stop trying to address. It is in the unconscious and in language where this most fundamental of antagonisms is articulated. One of the main reasons why psychoanalysis is a universal political tool, or can be, is because this antagonism in its most originary form is the family drama, in which the child has to navigate their way through the trauma of the parental relation and the many forms of thwarted or enigmatic desire and frustrated or suffocating demand which permeate the early years of subject formation. For many, this is the more traditional mummy, daddy, me, Oedipal triadic complex. For others, this can take other forms: single parents, two mums, two dads, adoption, foster care, and everything in between. For Lacaners, we know the Oedipal dimension of this became a question of structure and enjoyment, which transcended literal understandings of the anthropological or heteronormative nature of this problem. To put it simply, the happiness or misery of one's childhood is not dependent on having two parents of different sexes in a happy marriage, and neither is the potential for neglect or abuse less likely by virtue of the nuclear family being in place. Some might say, which is perhaps one of the major contributions of Freud to modernity, it's quite the opposite. In fact, it's by virtue of being born into these discursive relations of power and desire that all speaking subjects suffer from some form of trauma, although for some this trauma can be more debilitating than for others. The point is, no matter what your early experience of life has been, you will have had to negotiate the possibly detrimental desire of others and the laws set out for you before you were even born. In that sense, from birth, we are all equally helpless and at the mercy of symbolic structures that we have no way of controlling. And it's because our most intimate forms of enjoyment stem from the laying down of these early relationships that psychoanalysis is such a powerful and revolutionary tool, since it's the only discourse that recognizes the ambivalence at the heart of our most painful symptoms. The very things and people that make us suffer are often those that we're most reluctant to let go of. So in terms of the prime suspect of this book, capitalism, as Lyotard points out, we have to wonder why the poor, but in fact all of us, are content to swallow the shit of capital, because we all do. The point is not to expect us to stop consuming or being capitalist subjects, but to stop the system from making it our only choice. For example, how can you expect someone living on minimum wage and barely being able to pay for food, clothes, and rent to be simultaneously worried about recycling, buying organic, and not eating highly processed, overpackaged food, much less becoming an active political agent in global struggles that they have no part of on an everyday basis? They're not, and they can't be, especially when they're the ones shoveling the shit of capital. So how do we get people to realize that life could be otherwise for themselves and for others? Since the task of this book is to illuminate the necessary political nature of psychoanalysis, its intimate relevance to us as a tool for our own and our collective liberation, it seeks to distinguish it from the professions that have historically enacted a privatization of the mind to the point where mental life becomes something completely discrete and mysterious and amenable only to the privileged medical gaze. The psychologization of subjective suffering has gone hand in hand with neoliberal discourses on personal responsibility and the potential for unlimited individual wealth. Healthy mind, healthy bank balance is now the equation prevalent in the self-help world of Instagram. As we know, the only reason mental health became a buzz phrase in the last few decades is because capitalism caught on that depressed workers with unhappy home lives are not very efficient and tended to commit suicide. Mental health then is just a means of adjusting workers to the workplace. For example, in this country, Thatcher's crackdown on unions and the dissolution of society cemented the great British neoliberal phenomenon of mental health, which pops up in every commercial break during your Just Eat and Love Island bonanza. You're sad and alone in your suffering, and poverty is your own fault, but if you've got the gumption to take care of your mental health, all will be well. You can get back to work, hopefully lose some weight, buy some more stuff for your unaffordable home, and eventually get married. Psychoanalysis, on the other hand, gives you the tools to realize it may have been the work, the home, the wife, or the husband that was making you sick in the first place. A dangerous method indeed. It's interesting that Netflix has recently started to feature numerous series and films about the psych professions. In most of them, the relationship of the therapist to the client is one of immense sexual tension, drama, mystery, or menace. And needless to say, the therapist or psychiatrist is always portrayed as one who has superior, though clearly pseudoscientific knowledge of the mind, which they wield over the patient. This discourse of mastery is often, unsurprisingly, one which falls along gendered lines of the masculine knowledge over the classically hysterical female body. In the Netflix film Hypnotic, for example, the male psychiatrist employs hypnosis to entice his female patient to diabolical acts. Here, the common trope in pop culture of psychoanalysis is privileged access to a black box, a mysterious, occult, and dangerous tool that can be instrumentalized for evil, belies the underlying ideology prevalent in today's mental health discourse, that the mind is a dangerous place full of unspeakable desires and sadistic impulses. Of course, the mind is a dangerous place, but not because it's secretly evil and only to be understood by medical science, but rather because it's kept artificially opaque to itself, when in fact its secrets hide in plain sight. Psychoanalysis, far from being a practice of unraveling secrets from the position of expertise, is a practice of making the subject aware of its own knowledge, putting them in a position to act upon it freely and moving beyond or traversing whatever fantasy they were hampered by. It's a process by which the subject may become conscious of the power structures which gave rise to their suffering, whether those be microstructures of the family or macrostructures of the social bond. Ultimately, both of these dimensions of fantasy must be traversed in order for the subject to come to any form of liberation. I think some of the biggest challenges and potentials that we must negotiate in terms of the relationship between psychoanalysis and liberation are the changing conditions under which we can communicate with each other, the shifting technological production of knowledge, and the evolving parameters of human subjectivity, given the outsourcing of knowledge production to non-human entities. AI, big data, neuroscience, biotechnology, space travel, and colonization being some of the major frontiers we must consider. We're now dealing with the problem of such immense wealth in the hands of so few people that the kinds of technologies which these people are presiding over mean that many of the methods that we previously thought were viable need to be problematized and rethought. As Lacan would have called it, the alethosphere of individualized, self-referential knowledge production birthed by social media is just one of the technological challenges that arrive with the digital age, but many more conceptual mutations of digital existence await us. Zuckerberg's metaverse, Musk's Neuralink, and Bezos' space colonies, for example. The question then becomes, how can the fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, unconscious, repetition, drive, and transference, adapt to the changing permutations of human subjectivity? Given the changing relationships we're starting to have with our bodies, with our brains, and with our environments, those concepts will also have to evolve. And not to mention, of course, the vital question of trans and non-binary bodies and subjectivities as a challenge to some factions of the psychoanalytic establishment. Here we should refer to Paul Preciado's coinage of the term somatic, the body as a living political archive, one which he says takes into account the historic and externalized modalities of the body, those that exist and are mediated through digital, pharmacological, and prosthetic technologies. The somatic is mutating. So as I'm quite fond of doing, I'd like to use Kant's 3 Enlightenment questions to think of psychoanalysis as a mode of positioning the subject with respect to their own desire. It allows us to ask the questions, what can I know, what should I do, and what can I hope for? And I think this manifesto in its own way can do just that. Firstly, it provokes the reader to ask about their own conditions of experience, how their opinions have been formed, and why they see the world in the way they do. Secondly, it asks us to think about how to act upon the injustices that we experience ourselves and on behalf of others, and what it's possible to do with psychoanalysis for liberation movements. Thirdly, it asks what kind of world we could or should be striving for once psychoanalysis becomes possible. The author's answer is that once it's possible, it's no longer necessary, but on this point, I'm not so sure. For this reason, the only real defense that we have against the formidable enemy is the power of collective thinking about these conditions. And I think this book can be a very important tool in starting that conversation. And I'll end there.
Isabel, thank you so much. That was very, very helpful, very, very excellent. Last but not least is Gabriel Tupinamba, who's been with us since our very first study group session in the spring of 2020 and helped us also host a major global event with the publication of his book, The Desire of Psychoanalysis. So we've invited Gabriel to offer remarks today, and we're very happy he's a Brazilian-based psychoanalyst. Gabriel, the floor is now yours.
Hey, everyone. First of all, I really wanted to thank Daniel for this invitation. I'm really honored to be here with Ian, with David, with Isabel, and Nadia. I really like all of your works. I've been reading everyone here for some time. Some for longer than others, but still. And I was thinking what I wanted to comment on, but after listening to everyone, and David, he has this thing every time he presents something, I find it so powerful, and I was a bit kind of, I deviated from my original path just because I wanted to develop something that I heard in his presentation that I think shouldn't go unnoticed, should be I think a sort of additional level of we should pay some attention to it also when we read something like this, because if anyone ever tried to write something like this, like if you're, I'm a psychoanalyst, I'm involved in a lot of political activities in Brazil, and it's very hard to see something written in this way. And if you tried and failed at something at that direction, I think it just adds to the appreciation of what it is. And the point I want to make is that it's a very hard task to shape or to form a certain type of address when you write. I think that philosophical writings that have their own difficulty, but it's very specific type of style because of who and how you address people, right? You tend to address everyone's reasons, petition things that are consistent on a rational basis alone, at best, let's say, right? Psychoanalytic writing, I think it's a different form and it addresses people in a different way as well, because, I mean, at least if you take Lacan at his word, there is something about that obscure style that is trying not to suture, not to do away with a certain place for desire, right? The elbow grease, as he calls it, that we should put into the reading and so on. And I think that political writing is something else entirely. Because when you're writing something political, which I think this manifesto is before it is an analytic text, you're addressing concrete people, meaning there is no universal political text. You cannot address humanity politically. You want to address certain people and not others, even if you don't know who they are. And I think that's actually part of it, that there is an attempt to form a collective and the same measure that you address that collective, right? It's a very difficult task because it's always a situated statement, a situated enunciation, but it's inviting people to engage with a certain position. It might be confirming, consolidating that position, but the relation to the address, I think it's very, very complex. And I'd like to appreciate this manifesto in light of that challenge, which I think is not easy. I think that a lot of specific problems in the relations between psychoanalysis and politics are avoided by not really shifting the address of texts, meaning writing texts that want to address an other in an analytic sense while having political content inside of them. And I think that this is not the case at all. I mean, if you guys know Ian's work, David's work, you know that the relation between psychoanalysis or critical psychology and Marxism in their work is not one where the question, how do we move from psychoanalysis to arrive at politics? It never posed like that. Politics, a very old thing. It's something that is for anyone. And the existence of psychoanalysis, which is the thing in question. I think that this manifesto is I think one of the best examples I've seen, though I think their work gives us a lot of other strategies and examples of how to place psychoanalysis inside of the political, rather than first constructing this island and then imagining how you bridge your way out of it. How do you theoretically derive a political position? Politics doesn't need psychoanalysis, hasn't needed psychoanalysis for a very long time. So it's up for psychoanalysts to find if they are useful at all. And I think that this changes everything. I think that creates some very complicated challenges and also some very exciting possibilities. And to focus on the bad part, the challenges for a bit, I think that I'm not sure how many of you guys have the experience of, inhabiting the Lacanian community. But for example, one challenge that's very obvious if you go to seminars and see presentations, that Lacanians or psychoanalysts, I think it's beyond the Lacanian thing, but just to focus on my favorite bunch, psychoanalysts are not very good guests at other people's houses. They're very good hosts. They love having neuroscientists in their conferences, mathematicians, militants, inviting Paul Preciado once to do something, right? We're very good at it, but you've never seen a psychoanalyst in a mathematics conference, at a neuroscience conference. We don't know how to behave within the language of other people. We know very well how to translate it to our own kind of space, where we have the safeguard of having the last word, but we don't know how to address people in their language, which I think follows directly from what David said about this materialist listening, right? It exists inside the language of the other. So I think that that's already a first challenge. If you want to write a text that concerns psychoanalysis in some way, but buys into the challenge of being a political writing, you're going to have to face that challenge. We're not used to speaking in the language of others. And I don't mean when we do condescending examples or when we make funny little things, remarks, and so on, to exemplify the things we want to talk about. But I mean in the sense, which I think brings us to the second challenge, which is, let's say, the kernel of the first one, which is to allow psychoanalysis to be seen from the outside. It's very, very difficult to find a text or a presentation on psychoanalysis which is capable of allowing it to be indistinct with regards to other practices. For example, a text that would highlight in which way psychoanalysis is not different from bakery, from driving cabs, from something else, whatever it is. It's very common to find presentations, ways of us addressing others that think that the seductive power of psychoanalysis or of what we do comes from our singularity. But I've never seen a baker have to tell anyone, you should come to my bakery because it has the singular capacity of this and that. You can also seduce the other, convoke the other through what you have in common. So, and that's how politics works, right? To address concrete people from the standpoint of what we have in common. So how can we, who are not good guests at other people's houses, who can only seduce others about the usefulness of what we do through its singularity, never its commonality with other practices, how could we write a political text? So you guys see the sort of complicated backdrop which this manifesto is in its very form trying to wrestle with. The consequence of the second challenge of being seen from the outside, of not having the resource to that difference that will allow me to say something like, well, it's true that I make some money out of people suffering, but it's a singular practice, while everyone else profits from it in a totally distasteful way. When I do it, it's actually, you know, with this and that proviso. How to bear that silence, not completing that statement and not marking that difference. How to allow yourself to be kind of absorbed by that indistinguishability, right? It's hard to talk about the political economy of psychoanalysis without going through that. It's hard to talk about psychoanalysis relations to the sciences without going through that somehow. Even if you want to find a word in a scientific theory that will allow you to, again, find the singularity of psychoanalysis for scientists, you need to bear a certain moment in which that marker will not be there, right? If you want to find out that you're singularly useful to politics, you need to be able to tolerate an intermediate moment when we are not sure of that at all, that perhaps we're not distinct from anything else under the eyes of politics. So I think that this leads us to this third challenge, which is also very hard to face, which is to be evaluated by a practice which is not our own. I mean, one thing is to tell a social movement that, look, you guys are filled with problems that I know how to solve. So, you know, like some mafia kind of thing. I first tell you have a problem, which people wouldn't even perhaps sometimes know if I didn't tell them, and then I charge them for solving it. But what about being evaluated by the problems that politics says it has, the problems that movements say they have, right? The way that suffering is named, addressed, dealt with in politics is an evaluating tool that can look at psychoanalysis and divide its value, its usefulness in ways that we're not ready to admit. So perhaps our theory is not that useful. And some other aspect of psychoanalysis we're not very clear of is the useful part, or something like that. So you need to tolerate this, not only tolerate, let's say, not being sure if you're special as a practice and a theory, but also tolerate that what will make you special is not what you wanted in the first place to be confirmed by political practice to be the really crucial thing that we have to contribute to society or something like that. And finally, I think that the fourth challenge, which is connected to that, because once politics is allowed to evaluate the usefulness of psychoanalysis and not trust so much the things we have to say beforehand, which should guarantee this usefulness and already establish the bond with others in our own way. Once you let go of that and allow others to evaluate psychoanalysis, you need to be ready for dealing with problems which are not used to naming and limitations which you thought were not there. So I think that all of this is, these different problems kind of form a sort of backdrop for me when I was reading the book. And I think that I think that the sort of immediate response I have to it, which I think in some way mirrors some of the things that Nadia was talking about. Like, I'm a, Lacanian nerd, and of course I care a lot for Lacan and for all these things. And it's very hard to see something, how should I put it? To see a very complicated argument that takes usually hundreds and hundreds of pages to be properly sketched out, to be summed up in one page, and with a weight of what should be explained and what can be kept in silence or not nuanced, that makes my own practice perhaps look a bit simplistic, or the theory behind it look like something that is less sophisticated than it actually is. But I think that that's a very concrete price you need to pay for writing a political text on psychoanalysis. Because it's seeing psychoanalysis from the outside. I mean, this idea of being seen from a perspective that is not yours, it involves an idea that I think it's an idea of distance, right? And when you take a certain distance, things that are very clearly differentiated for you from close by might look like the same from afar, right? And this sort of, I know Mackenzie Wark talks about vulgar Marxism in these terms, and I think it has to do with this sort of vulgarity of really kind of coarse graining the theory to just a couple of words. It's something we also have a difficulty with doing. I know I do, which I think it says also something about other challenges of writing politically about psychoanalysis, or kind of immersing it in a political situation. So all these things, I think, give the very shape of this text, which I think the way that David was talking about it and Ian was talking about it also helped clarify that it makes sense that it takes this shape, not only because of their political commitments, but also because of the way that they decided to work on this, that it informs the very shape of this text. And I think that my basic comment today was just that I wanted to clarify at least my impression of these big challenges that are behind such a simple thing as a deceptively easy text. I think that it's a ridiculously hard challenge to face, and I think the result is really, really incredible. To conclude, I'm not sure how long I've been speaking, but to conclude, I just wanted to mention something which I wanted to hear you guys comment on if you want, which is the following. I think that there is an interesting question concerning, again, political form of writing, because to go back to the periodization question, right? It's interesting to see that, let's say, in the good old days of market capitalism establishing itself in Europe, revolutionary form was very much connected to the idea of utopia, right? You have utopian writings. It makes sense because capitalism was a very kind of geographically localized phenomena. You could speak of an outside. Therefore, the idea of moving your expectations of an other life to an other place made materialist sense. You could actually point somewhere where there is no capitalism and say, how about doing something there, right? And with what we call the imperialist phase of capitalism, we pretty much moved revolutionary imagination from space to time. So there is no outside of capitalism, no spatial outside, but we start speaking about before and an after as being, let's say, the basic grammar for locating something else. And I feel like the manifesto is the form for addressing politics in the grammar of time. It says something like, if you come with me, we're going to break history into two. There will be a before and there will be an after, right? And I have the impression, though it's just an intuition, that there is a question of political form or political style of writing today that sometimes makes the manifesto form not anachronic in the sense that it shouldn't be done, but poses new problems to the form of a manifesto. For example, if you address today liberation movements, you're addressing a highly fragmented other. You're addressing a very kind of equivocal space, which doesn't agree with each other minimally in its basic coordinates to constitute that concrete collective we were talking about at the beginning. Perhaps not to no one's surprise, this can be seen inside Lacanian organizations as well. I mean, I agree to some point that there is some reason that why we should be sectarian for structures, but I also think that it's not really that necessary. I mean, perhaps to this point, it's a bit kind of, okay, guys, it's perhaps that's not what they meant, you know. But with that in mind, I wonder what, I wonder what is the form, how do we deal with this? That to constitute the address of a political writing seems not only to address this kind of incapacity for being anyone or for being equal amongst people that a concrete group of people can have, but requires you to stitch it together somehow, right? And this is something that I know that both Ian and David worked in other places, but it's the only thing that I felt like was perhaps missing a bit in the text. I really wanted it to have appeared a bit more, because in many places of the text, they use the fact that psychoanalysis is at home in certain contradictions, that politics is perhaps sometimes still finding words to name and address, to suggest that we have, look, there is an idea of tension or conflict that we can benefit from, that psychoanalysis has good names, good kind of handles on it that we can use. But they're not only, let's say, to go back to Mao Zedong, not only the contradictions, the antagonisms with the bourgeois, but there are the contradictions within the people, right? And the contradictions within the people, in the case of psychoanalysis, they don't really necessarily appear in the figure of the divided subject, but they are the sort of thing that anyone in the outside sees very easily when they look towards us, right? The fact that there are 150 different groups, small little communities. So there is something at the level of organization of the Lacanian institutions, I think, which is something that is probably also a kind of a signal to politics that we're not that better off than most political groups to contribute somehow. And I wonder what you guys think about this, because I have the impression that a political form that includes this fragmentation as something we can name, address, localize yourself in, navigate, it's probably something that is going to become more and more important in the future in political writing, so that we can actually, let's say, meet this other, this concrete other of politics in its own terms, you know? but yeah, I'm just speculating at this level. It's just that I'm really happy to be here with you all and don't want to stop speaking, but thank you so much. I'll just stop here.
I'd like everyone to just give a little round of applause to our three respondents, or do one of these things since you're on mute. Gabriel, beautiful. Okay, David or Ian, you can choose who would like to go first, or you can speak together, however you wish, but let's give you both about 10-15 minutes, if that's okay, for you to respond. And then we go to the group, and feel free to put questions in the chat.
Well, I'm happy to go first. If that, okay, David agrees, because then he can then plug in some of the gaps and deal with some of the contradictions in my answer. I really appreciate the three interventions by Nadia and by Isabel and by Gabriel. It's so good to hear this and to hear sharp comments which cut into the text and open up its contradictions. This is really what needs to be done. I was thinking particularly about this last question of fragmentation that Gabriel raises, but in a way it's touched on also by Nadia and Isabel, which is that I think at different points when we were writing the text, we went backwards and forwards and were trying to integrate different ideas that we were introducing and struggling with and translating as we moved backwards and forwards between Spanish and English, between Mexico and Britain. And also in the discussions we were having with our political comrades about the ideas in the book, where conflicts were raised, problems were raised about audience, the kind of questions that Isabel was raising, and about how the text would be read. And I suppose because, even though we were writing a manifesto, there was a temptation to take the question of fragmentation and to deal with that question of fragmentation through smoothing over the text and adding different categories of identity or different categories of oppression, adding in a question about the exclusion of people who are disabled by capitalism, adding in at some point the question of trans, adding in the question of racism and colonialism, and attempting to integrate it into the text, which in a sense tried to do justice to the question of fragmentation, but actually in some sense at that very moment betrayed the question of fragmentation by incorporating it into the argument of the text. I feel now that we failed. Yes, of course we failed. And one question that was raised by David and that Gabriel picked up is this question of difficulty and common sense. And I suppose what we were attempting to do in our address to our audience of activists in liberation movements was to key into the fractures in common sense, to key into the sense that people have when they know that something is wrong in the world. They know that things do not fit together. They know that they are misrepresented in the media, that whatever identity they assume is scorned and caricatured, and the representations are turned against them. And in that conflict between what they know, what they feel, and what they see, and what they experience in the way that they're represented and spoken about, there's something in that of being a divided subject. There's something of the unconscious in there. So we wanted to go into that question of common sense, but open up the fractures in common sense in order that when we spoke about the difficulty of subjectivity, that is, the difficulty of living, the difficulty of being a human being, we were configuring it around that question of fractures in common sense and the possibility of change. But also at the same time, and this picks up and touches on questions raised by Nadia, to say that at the same time that we were using psychoanalysis, we also necessarily had to be anti-psychoanalytic. We have to recognize that psychoanalysis is one way of addressing these questions, a way that is privileged among certain kinds of practitioners, including ourselves because of our clinical work and our academic work. But there are many other ways of addressing these questions as well. Although I was brought up as an atheist, my discussions with David over the years have impressed on me that I should not quickly dismiss religion as being a dangerous, toxic ideological force, but appreciate the contribution made from within liberation theology, which is then expressed in some of the liberation movements through forms of liberation psychology, who have nothing to do with psychoanalysis and are scornful of psychoanalysis, that we have to acknowledge that our discourse is one discourse which may be useful among many discourses of liberation. The second point I want to address is the question of this framing of what we are doing as being Lacanian. And I feel now that this is a real trap that we fell into. And I must admit that I fell into when I structured the book in our first movement backwards and forwards around the concepts of unconscious, repetition, drive, and transference. For anyone in another psychoanalytic tradition, they immediately notice that this is Lacanian. And when we talk about signifiers and jouissance and the nature of the subject, those in other psychoanalytic traditions, in the Kleinian, object relations, relational traditions, immediately notice that this is Lacanian. And there's something of the context that we have to deal with here, which is sectarian relationship between different traditions in psychoanalysis. That's a first problem. Even though we might try and then be open with our Lacanian frame to the other traditions of work will immediately respond to us as speaking like Lacanians usually speak, that is, wanting to impose our own grid on them and interpret them and draw them into our framework of understanding. I'm very much aware here of Gabriel's writings on the internal politics of Lacanian psychoanalysis and the ways in which Lacanian psychoanalysis becomes an overarching frame for interpreting politics through the notion of the signifier, for example, which is extrapolated into everything, every domain of life, a particular conception of the signifier. And I think there are parallel movements inside the other psychoanalytic traditions as well that we need to work with. So another way of writing this text, which maybe needs to be done, maybe by us, maybe by someone else, is to go through a parallel track and work through the internal contradictions in other traditions of psychoanalysis and to connect then with politics through those other traditions, not only through the Lacanian tradition. Finally, the third point, and I think this really connects with the points that Nadia was making in her intervention, which is a very, very interesting intervention. And I will need to think more about the points that she made as rich conceptual points. But I would say that we don't only treat psychoanalysis in this book as a key. Psychoanalysis is not only the key, but psychoanalysis is also the lock. And what we aim to do in the book is to try and map out what this lock looks like, what the lock is that forms our subjectivity and that locates us within a political economic system, capitalism, so that it's then difficult to get out. That is, I think there's a danger in taking Lacanian psychoanalysis as the underlying assumption in some kind of universalized way. I'm reminded of the statement by Mark Fisher, a good comrade here in Britain, who says that it seems to be easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. And I think there is a danger among some left Lacanians that it's easier for them to imagine the end of capitalism than it is to imagine the end of psychoanalysis. And okay, good, at least they're imagining the end of capitalism. That's great. That's the fracture point where we come in and we're starting to make our argument. But we then need to open up the possibility to really think about how to dismantle psychoanalysis and think about other approaches to subjectivity that displace it, that provide alternative viewpoints, and that, okay, not everyone is going to like this, but relativize psychoanalysis, okay? Relativize it. I'll stop there.
Well, I will not respond, and Ian said many things that I wanted to say. Well, first, concerning the valuable comments of Nadia. Well, first of all, many thanks to Daniel Tut for organizing this, to Alfie Baum for publishing the manifesto, and to Isabel, Nadia, and Gabriel for their wonderful comments. Well, first, trying to respond only some points to Nadia. The first one is that I would say that the bad and the good is not the drive, but the way in which it is unsatisfied. The problem lies in the response, in what it enjoys, the capital or the signifier, the symbolic system of culture, or this system subsumed by the capital. About the periodization of the unconscious, I would say that the relationship between the unconscious and history should pose no problem if we assume the exteriority of the unconscious. After all, the unconscious is history, as Lacan says in defending himself against Sartre, who accused Lacan of neglecting history. It should not be forgotten also that Lacan rejects the opposition between history and structure. I would also like to say that we must bear in mind that Lacan, in his discussion with Althusser, dismisses science as an ideology of the suppression of the subject. We already know that the suppression is a precondition of psychoanalysis, but this does not reconcile it with psychoanalysis. Concerning the remarks of Isabel Millar and also of Nadia Ali, psychoanalysis will cease to be necessary. The questions about the necessity and possibility and the end of necessity of psychoanalysis in socialism. Psychoanalysis will cease to be necessary even if we are not in a communist society. It goes without saying that psychoanalysis is not eternal, as capitalism is not eternal. But there is an eternalization that Althusser and Lacan thought, each in their own way. In Lacan's case, we know his explanation for the ingenious capitalist discourse that has everything coldly calculated, even eternity, as in Pascal with his inaugural calculation of capitalism. But we also know that Lacan himself sees here one of the factors that produce the consumption of capitalism, the auto-consumption of the system. What is certain is that we cannot think about the day after this eternity. This is also a structural requirement as important as not thinking about the origin before eternity. This does not prevent us from desiring this after eternity. About what Isabel said of the purpose of psychoanalysis, I wanted to say something about this purpose of psychoanalysis, so beautifully expressed by Isabel. I am referring to the purpose of making subjects aware of the knowledge that concerns them and positions them in relation to their desire. This purpose actually may also be an interpretation of the purpose of creating class consciousness in communist strategy. I think this point is it's very important, both for Ian and me. About what Gabriel Tupinamba said, Gabriel raises a fundamental question, that of the inability of Lacanian theorists and practitioners to participate in other forms of knowledge and thus leave their sphere, get out of their sphere, considering it without means of communication and mediation towards other spheres, under the assumption that it is exceptionally unique, exterior with respect to everything else. There is here, I think, I'm convinced, and I think Gabriel also, a belief in the other of the other, in a meta language, which ensures theoretical consistency at the price of the theory's betrayal, since the lack of meta language, as you know, is at the very foundation of Lacanian theory. Gabriel realizes very well that psychoanalysis is part of the problem for us. This Ian already noted in other terms minutes ago. This can also answer many of Nadia's valuable comments. As Ian said, we were aware that we should be anti-psychoanalysts. It is inevitable, unavoidable, to be anti-psychoanalysts when the absolutization of the discourse of psychoanalysis, to which we already referred, is rejected. We did not want to speak in Lacanism, but to a certain degree, we finally did this, as Ian well recognized. I agree with Ian that this is a problem of our manifesto. And this also opens the manifesto to critiques from the theoretical idea of consistency of the Lacanian theory. The concept of prefiguration, another remark about the thing that Gabriel said, the concept of prefiguration as conceived by Rosa Luxemburg allows us to situate what we are fighting for in a spatial and simultaneously in a temporal place. This location must be considered in the light of retroactivity and fragmentation, and probably in this way, in this articulation between the two dimensions, we can avoid this problem of looking the way to not confront seriously the problem of fragmentation. This is what I would say. Thank you very much.
Nadia, feel free to jump in as any response that you may have at this point, and then we'll hear briefly from Isabel and Gabriel. And for folks that wish to speak, you can raise your hand or use the chat. Feel free, Nadia, to jump in though if you would like first, and then we can go to Isabel.
I mean, you know, it's quite late where I am. It's kind of almost midnight, but so I'm a bit kind of slow at the moment. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, there's a lot to discuss. I appreciate the answers that, you know, or the kind of the thoughts that David and Ian had, and it's, you know, it's almost kind of like, you know, Marx was never a Marxist, right? And then somehow we're in the situation where, you know, this is you know, there's a lot of, you know, the Lacanism that seems to be both the curse and the blessing of this manifesto is intriguing. It's intriguing to see this kind of to see the discussion a bit revolve around that. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot, I mean, to get into. I don't know how much time we have, but I'm happy to just, take the comments as they are, and perhaps, yeah. I mean, I think because there's a lot of points, like in a sense, I would perhaps the way to maybe just a general remark is that, of course, I'm with this relativization, right? That I think Ian and David are keen on, and I think it's a very good move. And as I said at the beginning, I think this is a very generous undertaking, and being, hospitable to so much of the discourses that are around and abound in the contemporary moment. And I think it's necessary, right? And perhaps maybe to think about the manifesto here would be, it's a political act in a sense, right? Rather than just a form of writing, right? So, I mean, the form is of course crucial, but the act of putting forth this kind of manifesto is in itself political. And this is something I think we would all agree on, right? Yeah, so yeah, I'll just say that.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
So it is time. I think if folks, have to leave, of course, we will not hold you hostage. It's okay. It's a Friday after all. And for some of you, it's very late. So Nadia, thank you so much for being here. We're going to close. Isabel, Gabriel, if you have any comments, I'm not seeing any hands. So I think that the panel brought up so much rich insight and depth that perhaps people are, although Sean has a question. So Sean, hold tight real quick. And Isabel, any comments? You can also pass if you wish. It's up to you.
No, I have nothing to say other than it was really wonderful to hear you all and hear everybody's responses, and other than to reiterate what I think a fantastic endeavor, and to underline what Nadia just said about it. Actually, it's a question of a political act rather than necessarily quibbling over exactly the kind of interpretation of what we're doing with psychoanalysis in this instance. I think it's a necessary and very important undertaking that is really complex, what they've done, and I congratulate them. That's it. Thank you.
I would like to just say one really quick thing.
Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking here, like just as a provocation, because we were talking about the end of psychoanalysis in a communist society. I don't think it's hard to imagine that. Imagine the following situation, okay? You're living in a communist society, you go to the park, you meet a stranger, and because you're a stranger to him, he says something to you he probably wouldn't say to friends or family. And rather than engaging with your opinion, you listen to the person and you intervene in a certain way. Perhaps you agree to meet the next week in the park again. And there are relations of politeness, there are amorous relations, there are friendships. Why couldn't analytic relations be just another form of social interaction that people hold themselves responsible for having with other people? It's not psychoanalysis, definitely, but it's something else. You would still want to theorize about it. Perhaps if we still have our universities, we'll still have a job, don't worry, but it's something else.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I leave you with that idea.
Again, we're going to close soon, but Sean, please jump in.
Yeah, I just had one quick question. I've been thinking about it since you said it, and you'll have to correct me if I, don't quote it correctly. But Ian, during your talk, you mentioned something about sort of resisting psychotherapeutic and psychiatric tendencies within psychoanalysis. And as someone who is like a university student studying psychology, I want to know a little bit more about what you meant by resisting those sort of tendencies within psychoanalysis.
Oh my God, thank God, at last, a question I can answer. So psychiatry is a medical practice which basically boils down to making a diagnosis and pushing the pills or other kinds of awful physical treatment. Psychotherapy believes that things can be resolved into communication so that everyone understands everyone else, and there's direct connection with our emotions or our feelings. A dead end. It's not true, because we speak, we have a language that always divides us at the same time as we communicate with it. And psychology focuses on our bad thoughts and tries to put them right so that we can adapt to this terrible society. Psychoanalysis does none of these things. Well, that's not true, because some psychoanalysts are psychiatric, some psychoanalysts are psychotherapeutic, and some psychoanalysts are psychologists. So we are making an intervention here to argue that psychoanalysis, authentic psychoanalysis, is against these practices and is giving space to the subject to speak for themselves, and most importantly, as a political act, that subject is not confined inside the individual, but can become collective subject. The notion of subject is broader than what is contained inside our little individual selves. But what it is to be subject is to be collective, is to be part of a collective. Okay.
Thanks, much appreciated.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, friends and comrades, it's been a real blessing, a real honor to be with you this afternoon. I want to thank all of our speakers, Ian, David, Nadia, Isabel, Gabriel. Thank you all so much. We learned an immense amount today, as always. We have, just as a little plug, an upcoming winter reading group on the great Lukács's Destruction of Reason, which will culminate in a major symposium we're going to actually put together in February. So happy to share that information with you all on our Twitter feed and elsewhere. Again, thank you all. And with that, wish you a great weekend and a wonderful Friday evening. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.